doing these. Your words of wisdom, really important, and reaching out to people in every corner of the world. We have to get there. So thank you very much. And I don't know, do I need to introduce the topics that we're talking about? Do you want me to do that? Let me quickly do that. Ken, what do you think?
Whatever you would like, Vikram.
Because I do tell people that I am a little abrupt, but like I said, I have to balance between wasting your time and also letting people know. So basic, of course, information available at mediatorvikram.com. So right now we have, of course, so many people have a part of the symposium or have been part of the symposium, and we've had wonderful discussions. Andrea brought us a definition from the American Philosophical Association, which I took out, and we had discussions on that. So it's been interesting. The discussions have been nice, and of course, all the information there. World Mediation Circle, I have to keep repeating. This is the focus area now, Ken, to develop these mediation circles in every school, community, country, issue-based and all. The only thing I was discussing with Andrea also and Busy was that the fact that I'm a little selective of who comes in. So that's what, because Andrea kept saying that you've created this safe space. And we were just having that discussion on that safe space, because I maybe have taken it to a total extreme, but I said, I have to, it's like, whom do I bring into my living room? I was telling Andrea that there was someone who was rude to her. She might said, she does, I don't even think that she knows about it, but just the fact that I could feel that is bad enough. So of course, maybe she doesn't like the fact that maybe because of her, some people might not be part of it, but that's the way it is. So what I did put out was that, like, become a patron. So there is a link here, be a patron, because and people should in some way contribute. It's a good thing. And of course, the schedule and everything is there. So I think that's about it. But 1 minute, one more second. What's coming up on the 12th, which of course you are part of, like always. So this is what we're doing for the 12th to 16th, neutrality and mediation. And I feel this is an important discussion. And like Ken said, Bernie should be giving the keynote address, and he's the keynote speaker. So that's what we have coming up. People who want to take part, please get in touch. Ken, here onwards, your show is, what do you want me to introduce you to? Mandy was there. Liz, you met earlier. Mandy is from a very beautiful island in Greece. To pronounce it, I also have to look here. Zakynthos. She's from Zakynthos. And very beautiful views, lovely. The views of the sea from her island, yes, but her views on life and on mediation and everything. She had a session just a few minutes back, so really nice. And Catherine, of course, put together this association with the Hellenic Union of Mediators and OPEMED. And so that's the introduction. So Ken, your show, please.
Thank you, Vikram. And I think it's wonderful that we have Greek participants today, because ancient Greece was really the birthplace of philosophy. What I'd like to do to begin with is to take some inspiration from Albert Einstein in discussing this topic of philosophy. He said, in quotes, "Make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler." And the difficulty is that philosophy for many people is perceived as an obstacle, as boring, as useless, as extraneous to the work that we are doing. So what I would like to do instead is to look a little bit at some deeper ways in which philosophy can be of some assistance to us. I'd like to start with 4 relatively simple foundational questions. 1, what is philosophy? 2, what does it have to do with mediation? 3, is there some branch, excuse me, or field of philosophy that is especially suited to conflict resolution? And 4, how can philosophical inquiry make us better mediators? So to begin with, what is philosophy? And our Greek-speaking participants today will tell us that the word philosophy is Greek. Philo means love, and Sophia, if you will, is wisdom. So it means love of wisdom. At least this is my understanding of it. You may have a more accurate description of it. But simply, philosophy is an attitude. It is a perspective. It is a way of living what Socrates called an examined life. It's logical curiosity, reasoned imagination. So the combination of reason and imagination and logic and curiosity, essentially what this means is it's trying to figure out what it's all about, what's really going on here. It's thinking about what is not known or what is not agreed upon, what's confusing, what's contradictory. And so philosophy is a way of simplifying what we know about reality, but it occupies a somewhat unusual place in that reality. Bertrand Russell, professor of philosophy at Oxford University in England, wrote a book called A History of Western Philosophy, and it's a really wonderful, terrific introduction to Western philosophy. And what he wrote was this, I'd like to quote him. He says, all definite knowledge belongs to science. All dogma as to what surpasses definite knowledge belongs to theology. But between theology and science, there is a no man's land, exposed to attack from both sides. This no man's land is philosophy. So in other words, what happens if we know something is that it enters the realm of science. What happens if we can't know anything about it is that it enters the realm of what you could call metaphysics, or theology, or spirituality, or any number of different ways of imagining what is there. But in between is an effort to try to figure out how to think about the things that we want to think about. So it's not just what is mediation, but how do we think about mediation? And so virtually all of philosophy is contested, that is, in conflict with itself. And the reason that it's in conflict with itself is because it is inherently, as Karl Popper, philosopher in 20th century Europe, wrote, it is unfalsifiable. That is, you can't prove that a philosophical proposition is absolutely incorrect or correct. And if you can, once again, it enters the realm of science. There was a US philosopher whose name is William James, who wrote something kind of about this, which is, he said that to be a real philosopher, all that's necessary is to hate someone else's way of thinking. And what that means is philosophy is itself a kind of arena of conflict. So it isn't so much about what we know, it's about how we know and why we know and what we can't know, and how our knowing could be wrong and lead us astray. So it's about trying to understand things that seem to defy understanding. And therefore it's highly speculative. But every speculation is a little step in the right direction. It's a way of trying to put together a way of living in the world that combines together what is essential to the self and what is essential to others. So how do we do this? Well, the answer is it is a life process that each one of us has to go through individually. And so I would say that instead of there being a philosophy, there are philosophies, and that every individual on the planet has a kind of philosophy to whatever extent they think about whatever it is that their life experiences have been. That is a kind of philosophy. And what we can see is that people in conflict come into mediation sessions with a kind of philosophy that isn't expressed, but nonetheless it guides their actions. It conditions their statements. It creates a kind of relationship which is unspecified between them, the two parties, because they're each coming to the conflict with a different set of attitudes. So what I'd like to do is to start with kind of building a sense of what a mediator's philosophy might consist of. And because here's the first element, in a way, in that philosophy. What is mediation? Answer: it is an operation that we perform on a conflict in order to reduce or eliminate it. So what determines the nature of mediation? Answer: the nature of conflict. Well, that's a kind of philosophical understanding of what it is that conflict resolution is about. But I'd like to go a little bit deeper than that and start with where does this conflict come from and what is our philosophy of conflict? So I'd like to begin with 3 philosophical propositions. And then we can expand those. I have listed 10 of them and some of the things that I've written. And if people are interested, I've written a little bit about this in the book that I wrote called The Dance of Opposites. So here are 3 fundamental philosophical propositions that have a major, profound, determining impact on the nature of our mediation process. Proposition 1, no 2 people are the same. Relatively simple, but because of the fact that no 2 people are the same, what it means is that there is the possibility of conflict arising simply from the existence of diversity among human beings. If we were all the same, there would be no conflict. Number 2, no single person is the same from one moment to the next. This is fundamentally what originates with Heraclitus, as we call it in the United States. Heraclitus, I think it would be in Greek. And what he said basically is you can never step into the same river twice because the river is constantly flowing. What is the river? It's us. We are the river, and we are constantly changing. Proposition number 3, conflicts are complex, deep, multifaceted, multidimensional, and constantly changing. Now, let's add these 3 fundamental philosophical propositions together, and what do you get? Answer: nobody can tell you how to mediate, and you can't possibly know what you're going to do next in any mediation because it hasn't happened yet. It means that fundamentally what we are dealing with is unstable, chaotic, constantly moving. What does this mean for mediators? It means we have to be constantly moving too. We have to be open to chaos. If we approach conflict resolution as a strictly ordered process, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, that would be very nice, except that whatever it is that you do at 9:15 bombs at 9:17. It's not going to work anymore. And whatever it is that worked with Fred isn't going to work with Alice. And it may even be that what it is that you just said, or what they said to each other, fundamentally shifts the dynamics between them. And so therefore, as a matter of philosophy, what we have to accept is it is not only undetermined, it isn't possible to determine in advance how things are going to go, what's going to happen. So those are 3 fundamental philosophical propositions. But now I'd like to do something more helpful, and that is to give you the opposite of those fundamental propositions. 1, yes, no 2 human beings are alike, and yet we're remarkably similar. Number 2, no single person is the same from one moment to the next, and yet there's something continuous in our lives that goes from birth to death. Yes, conflicts are complex, multi-determined, multifaceted, constantly changing, and there is something similar between all conflicts in how we perceive them, how we respond to them, what they mean to us. And so the combination of these 3 fundamental philosophical propositions with their exact opposite philosophical propositions begins to give us some sense of how it is that philosophy might assist mediators in figuring out what the heck we're doing. So this is a beginning. What this means, I think the fundamental idea here of philosophy is the idea of abstraction from reality, sort of multiple experiences with reality, to some fundamental idea or principle. So here's one of them, that probably one of the simplest of all. We know from lots of experiences with conflict that it is worse when people are not listened to, and it is easier to resolve when they feel someone has been listening to them. Just even any form of kindness in a conflict that we are involved in, we know makes a difference. So then we can abstract from that some idea that mediators ought to listen to what it is that people have to say. How should they listen? Well, if you sit there and do nothing passively, you're still making a contribution. But if you are actively involved, having some back and forth, some conversation, if you are actively listening, then the person is going to feel more like they have been heard. If the listening is responsive, if it's empathetic. And now we can begin to break those things down and see what they actually consist of. But instead of saying from the beginning, mediation consists of active listening, we now understand from first principles why it is that we're listening. And as a result of that, we will be able to listen in a much more profound and deep and successful manner. Now, we can also get much of this information from science, and we can get some of this information also from what we can think of, and what I know Vikram is going to be doing a session on spirituality. We can get it from some sense of our of the meaning of our conflict and what significance it has in our lives. Its poignancy, if you will. And yet, what we have to fundamentally begin with is the idea that there is a limit on how much we can know, how much we can do. And this is very similar to what you have probably heard about in connection with Werner Heisenberg, who wrote about the uncertainty principle in physics. So the uncertainty principle says basically that an elementary particle is moving, and if you want to know where it's located, and you also want to know how fast it's moving, or even what direction it's moving in, there is a limit on how much you can understand that. Because at a very simple level, if you just shine a particle of light on that electron, let's say, it changes the direction of the electron because the light has to bounce off of it. But Heisenberg's principle is more fundamental than that. And what it says, you can really understand it quite simply mathematically. Any change in the position of a particle and any change in the momentum of a particle, if you subtract those from one another, the answer has to be greater than a very small amount, which is Planck's constant. And I'm simplifying this here, but there's something similar here. Alan Watts, who is a Zen, a writer about Zen, said that there is an element of what he called irreducible human rascality. Human beings are rascals. We are fundamentally, sort of unable to be pinned down precisely. There's some little piece of life inside of every human being that no matter how good we get at understanding human nature, we can't quite get that last little piece. And we see it every day. We see it in the news. We see it in how Ukrainians are reacting, how Russians are responding. We see it in the ways that people's lives get upended in Pakistan, in Somalia, in various other places as a result of what happens in war. And so it's important for us to build into our practice the understanding that it is somehow, there's some element of what is, oh, sorry, hold on one second. There is something that can't be predicted. Now, let's go on to the second question, or really, I guess it's the third question, which is there any kind of philosophy, any element of philosophy, any kind of philosophy that would prove useful for mediators? And I think that the answer is yes. And it comes directly from Socrates. And what Socrates, of course, it existed before Socrates, but what Socrates referred to it as is dialogue, the dialectic. And that is the understanding of opposition. So every conflict exists in opposition. There is opposition in every conflict. Without opposition, there is no conflict. And what has happened is that over a period of centuries, various individuals and groups of people have contributed to some understanding of what we can think of as dialectical philosophy. Initially, this came out of religion, out of sort of wisdom traditions and what you can think of as spiritual dialectics. And probably the best example of this is from Lao Tzu in China, in the Tao Te Ching, what's called the Tao. I'd like to quote from Lao Tzu. Here are two examples. Actually, I'll give them, I'll give three. Here's one. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. He who stands on tiptoe doesn't stand firm. He who rushes ahead doesn't go far. He who tries to shine dims his own light. He who defines himself can't know who he really is. He who has power over others can't empower himself. He who clings to his work will create nothing that endures. Pretty interesting, huh? And we can see that a lot of this has application in conflict. He who tries to shine dims his own light. He who defines himself can't know who he really is. Now, aren't these things that happen in conflict? Don't we see them in every mediation that we do? And then he says something else that's also useful. Take time to listen to what is said without words, to obey the law too subtle to be written, to worship the unnameable, and to embrace the unformed. And I think this is, to me, this is what we do in conflict resolution. We listen to what is said without words. And so this is an example of what you can think of as spiritual dialectics. That is an understanding of the opposition and the nature of opposition, the nature of contradiction, and therefore the nature of conflict. Second, so this is the first source, it seems to me, of understanding of what we can think of as dialectical philosophy. The second one comes out of philosophy itself. That is out of originally by elaborated by Immanuel Kant, and then picked up by Hegel in Germany, and then by Karl Marx. And one of the reasons why dialectics is not understood well today is because it's associated particularly with Marx. But there's a lot of in philosophy about the nature of dialectics, and I'll come back to what each of these people contributed in a moment. The third source of this philosophy is what we can think of as scientific and mathematical dialectics, that is the philosophy of science and the philosophy of mathematics, which allow us to understand kind of how opposition works in the universe. So there's positive and negative as an illustration. There is hard and soft, there's large and small, there's virtually every kind of distinction that you want to make exists in opposition to some other idea. So then what we want to think about is, what are the laws of opposition? How exactly does opposition work? And then I'd like to suggest that there is a fourth arena for philosophical dialectics, and that is conflict resolution itself. That is, I think we, as practicing mediators, have begun to understand some of the philosophical principles that allow us to get some deeper understanding of those laws. So now let's kind of get a sense of exactly kind of what this is. And in order to do this, we need to go back to Aristotle. So actually, it isn't just Aristotle. First of all, there's Plato, who described dialectics as a method of argument in Socratic dialogue. What Socrates did, if you read his dialogues, and I recommend highly that you do this because they're brilliant, is that he would set up an opposition between one idea and another idea. What is virtue? Well, what is the opposite of virtue? And now what can we understand about virtue by the nature of this opposition? And he sets up a conversation in which someone advances an idea, and during the course of that conversation discovers that he hasn't got the foggiest idea what he's talking about. And in a way, this is what happens in conflict resolution. People come forward with issues, knowing that they are right, and advancing those issues. And yet, in the course of conversation, they discover that they didn't really have a very good grasp on what those issues really were. Or maybe they didn't think about what the other person had to say, or how they experienced the problem. And so the dialogue, which is the essential form of philosophical dialectics, becomes an essential element in conflict resolution that helps us get some understanding of what it is that we are doing. Now, there's a problem here. And of course, we can talk about Zeno, about Heraclitus, about Democritus, about Euclid and Archimedes, all of these people who really contributed enormously to this field. But what I'd like to suggest is that we have to take a critical look at Aristotle's ideas about logic. And if you read Aristotle's logic, you will discover that there are three fundamental laws. What he called the law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction. So what are these? So the law of identity is just a statement is what it is. In other words, A is identical to A. Yet, we know in conflict resolution that there are times when A is not entirely A. And there are many different ways in which people will identify something as important to them, and it turns out that it's much more complex than that. Politically, we can see that statements are made all the time that don't really mean what they're purported to mean. People will make statements about, being tough on criminals. But what they're really talking about is a philosophy and a set of social policies about how we treat people who are poor, or just simply how we treat people. The second is, and this is really the most important one for us, the law of the excluded middle. And what Aristotle says is, a statement is either true or false, and it can't be true and false at the same time. But we know in conflict resolution that there are many times that things are true and false at the same time. In fact, almost every single statement that you can imagine being made in mediation is true for one person, but not necessarily true for the other. And it may be true in one sense for that person and not in some other sense for them. And what that indicates to us is there is a deeper truth. And that's the gateway into the conflict resolution process, the realization that at the center of this contradiction is not an excluded middle, but an included middle, a necessary middle. And that middle piece is what defines our work as mediators. And by middle, I mean not compromise, but underneath. And I can show you a kind of diagram of how this works, but I'm going to hold off on doing that for a little bit. So this is the second piece of Aristotle. The third piece is the law of non-contradiction. And that is any statement and its contradictory statement can't both be true. If A is true and B is the opposite of A, both A and B cannot be true. So if A is hot and B is cold, the thing can't be both hot and cold at the same time. And yet we know in conflict resolution, this happens all the time. People say things and their contradictory statements are often true at the same time. I love you, I hate you. Which one is true? For some people, it's both simultaneously. Come here, go away, right? So there are many different ways in which the philosophy of contradiction, of opposition, of conflict, if you will, requires us to move away from Aristotle's assumptions about logic, which have been the fundamental basis of Western philosophy for millennia. So what do we then have to do? I think we have to go back to Eastern philosophy, spiritual philosophy, and some of the later philosophical developments, including scientific developments, and see what it is that we can do instead. So what is dialectics? It is an effort to understand the nature and the forms of opposition. It is the rules for combining opposites or inverses or contradictions. It is what happens when things contradict one another. What are the movements that take place in conflict? How do people shift from one to another? And what are the different ways in which it becomes possible when there is a contradiction to find some way out of that contradiction? And here I'd like to give you the simple answer. And this comes from what is called the Hegelian dialectic. And the Hegelian dialectic is simple: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis is any statement that you want to make, which can be, we have a marriage that's working. Antithesis, we have a marriage that isn't working. What is the synthesis? The synthesis is a creative combination of opposites that leads to some new thesis, which is we have a marriage that works sometimes and doesn't work at other times. And what can we do to figure out how to make it work better more often? Right? So that's a synthetic approach, meaning a way of creatively combining things that are opposites. And I think this defines what it is that we do. I think that we are in the business of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And now, how exactly do we do this? How do we understand them? Well, in the first place, what this means is this philosophy tells us that the first thing that we have to do is we have to bring opposing perspectives and views and feelings and ideas into dialogue with one another. We have to bring people face to face who disagree with each other, who dislike each other, who hate each other. And we have to help them figure out how to talk to each other. And then what we have to do is search within the rubble of that conversation for how it might be possible for both to be true and neither to be true at the same time. And to me, that is the source of synthesis. It is trying to figure out what is right about what both people are saying and what isn't right about what both people are saying. And now what the heck do we do with this? Well, we kind of examine it and look at it and think about it, and somehow, and I can't tell you that I really understand how. I have some feelings about it, but I can't really define it exactly. Somehow we figure out a way of doing this that transforms the circle of conflict into a spiral. And that's the synthesis. You have point A, and you have the opposite of point A, which is point B. What are we looking for? How do we get to C? And on some level, we have to bring A and B into conversation with one another, create the circle that goes back and forth between them, or the cycle, the vicious cycle, whatever you want to call it. And then we have to figure out how we leave both of those things behind. So I'm right. No, you aren't. Yes, I am. No, you aren't. That's a circle. You you did it. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. It'll go on forever. What do we get? How do we get out of that? No, yeah, you did it. No, I didn't. Well, would either of you be willing to agree not to do this again in the future? That's the beginning of a cycle that turns into a spiral. So what's the technique? Shift from the past to the future. What's the purpose of shifting from the past to the future? To escape the cycle of blame and shame and just going around and around on who's right and who's wrong and never getting anywhere. If you can prove who's right and who's wrong, you should go to court. And if that really matters to you. But guess what? If you want a relationship, that's not going to be helpful. Being right and knowing that you're right is a curse. In fact, there's an Italian curse that says, may you have a lawsuit in which you know that you're right. And then sometimes it's revealing through the dialogue, the logical flaws, the feelings that are uncomfortable. Asking, for example, how does this feel to you? If that were true, what do you think the consequences would be? And are those consequences the ones that you want? And what do you want? And what would you be willing to do in order to get it? What are we missing in this conversation? What needs to be created that doesn't yet exist, right? Any of those questions are going to move you in a different direction. So now the question then becomes, how exactly do we do this? And I think that there are, well, let me just give an example of this. I'll just give you two little charts from some materials that I have. Is this okay with you, Vikram, if I share my screen now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I've sort of did some charts as a way of trying to explain this, because sometimes visually it's easier. So here's the first one. This is what dialectic and dialogue really are essentially about. We begin down at the bottom. And at the bottom, what we have is an issue or a problem. And then we have idea A, that's the thesis. And then what we get is idea B, which is antithesis or the difference from A. And then we try to figure out how to get to idea C. And then we show that there's the kind of vector of resolution, which is what leads from the problem to C. So this is the first one. This is just very simple, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to apply it in a difficult situation. And this is a situation where, for example, you may be in a workplace or maybe it's political. But let's assume that we're dealing with now politics. And so what I did, and now we're working from the top to the bottom. And so we have at the very top, what I call the ground of public necessity. It just means, we can also call it the ground of the problem. There's a need to solve a problem that exists in the public. There's a range of alternatives. We have order on the one hand and anarchy on the other. We have centralization along with order and decentralization with anarchy. If you follow order, and that's your approach in centralization, the positive is obedience and the negative is rebellion. And here you introduce a new idea, which is a non-transformational synthesis. And the non-transformational synthesis, the simple combination, which is essentially compromise, is a non-transformational synthesis, is public compliance and private defiance. That's what you get when you combine order and rebellion in a non-transformational way. Now let's shift over to anarchy and decentralization. The positive is freedom. The negative is isolation. The non-transformational synthesis is private liberty and public chaos, right? That's a compromise between freedom and isolation, but it's not transformational. A transformational synthesis is ordered anarchy and centralized decentralization. And what does this mean in practical terms for organizations? It's a combination of leadership and self-directed teamwork. That's what works in organizations in order to actually solve the problem of order versus anarchy and centralization versus decentralization. Notice that the answer isn't one, it's two, creatively combined and in ways that potentially produce better outcomes. So that's a kind of illustration of what I think is going on with kind of a rough cut on dialectics as a kind of a diagram. Now let's take a look at what are some actual dialectical operations, some real principles, philosophical principles that may be able to help us. Here's one. And this is, I have 25 of these. And if you're interested, it's a chapter in, I'm not going to go through all 25 of them, but it's a chapter in the book that I wrote called The Dance of Opposites. Here's proposition one. It's the proposition of the universality of opposition. That is, all things exist and arise as opposites. In Buddhism, this is referred to as dependent origination or mutual arising. That is, and this is the Taoist principle that I mentioned before, everything exists and arises and disappears as opposites. Second principle, what's called the interpenetration of opposites. But in other words, all opposites contain elements of the other. So that in the yin-yang principle, there's a little bit of white in every black and a little bit of black in every white. And we can see this in conflict resolution as well. In a conflict between parents over curfew with their children, we have two principles, the principle of safety and the principle of enjoyment. Which one's right? Well, it turns out that they're both right. And not only that, there is a little bit of enjoyment and safety and a little bit of safety and enjoyment. Now, that's the part that makes it interesting and complex and able to be, I think, useful in conflict resolution. And these first three principles come from spiritual dialectics. The third one is the transience of all things. Everything changes. Heraclitus, however we pronounce it. In Buddhism, again, this is known as impermanence, meaning nothing's stable, everything's changing constantly. And then I think we identified from philosophical dialectics what I would call the movement towards synthesis, from thesis to antithesis to synthesis. And this fundamental principle means that whatever the outcome is, it is a movement in the direction of greater complexity, of greater, sometimes simplicity at the same time as complexity. It is a movement towards a higher order of skill in being able to handle the problems that you have had difficulty handling. And here we come across a definition, one of my alternative definitions of conflict. It is simply a lack of skill at being able to handle someone else's behavior. Because some people can be in the presence of it and not be bothered. So that means a part of what we are doing is skill building. Have you considered asking your spouse this question? Why does this matter so much to you? Why do you feel so deeply and passionately about this issue? What does it mean to you? Right? Now, what is that? That's a skill building process which understands intuitively that what is missing in the marital relationship is some I think we could think of it on two different levels. One is, sort of some ability to step back from the conflict and look at it and figure out what you might be able to do differently. But the second really is a kind of shift in who you are in the relationship, in which you become someone who is curious about the other person, about who they are, who sees them not as fixed and static, but as growing and evolving and capable of defining for themselves what's important. Here's another principle from philosophical dialectics: the unity of opposites. That is, opposites are polarized in appearance, but unified in essence. How do we say it? Why? How is this the case? Every polarity, if you think of a pole like the North Pole and the South Pole, the North and South poles of the Earth are connected along a line of magnetism. That is, there is a line directly connecting the North and South poles, which is a magnetic line, which turns from positive to negative. In other words, it flips into opposition, but the line itself is unified. And in a similar kind of way, people are unified by their opposition to one another. They are the people who care the most about these issues in opposite ways, but they care about them. And so it becomes possible for us to see that there is a kind of unity of difference. And that can be helpful to us. There are a series of others, but I'm not going to go through them. There actually, I have 25 of them. What the point that I would like to make about this really is that there's a fundamental difference in conflict resolution between what I described before as a non-transformational synthesis, which is compromise, which is essentially settlement, and the deeper and more powerful transformational possibilities that arise when we invite conflicting ideas into dialogue with one another. I think what we are doing is essentially Socratic. And what we want to then do is to not only create the conversation, between A and B, in which they both look at the possibility for there to be a C. But we try to move the conversation itself to a higher dimension by inviting emotions into the conversation, by asking questions about interests. And so a part of what the mediator is someone who stands outside that conflict, and it is at the same time inside it. Being inside it gives you a sense of empathy, and being outside of it gives you a sense of creativity, of being able to come up with something that might conceivably work a little bit better than what you had thought. There's an example of this, for example, in what is in psychology called dialectical behavior therapy, which is an evidence-based form of therapy that basically adopts the idea that two ideas inside of each of us can be true at the same time. So it's possible, for example, to say, oh, I really don't feel like exercising today, and boy, wouldn't it be nice to feel that energy coming from doing something. And both of those can be true at the same time. And then looking for ways of combining them. So you can take a look at dialectical behavior therapy, which has, it emphasizes distress tolerance skills, mindfulness and meditation skills, emotional regulation, emotional intelligence skills, and conflict resolution skills. Now, there is, I guess, a kind of last piece of this that I'd like to mention. If we imagine that every conflict takes place, that you have to have two or more in order to have a conflict. That is, there have to be two. The question then becomes for mediators, how is it possible to turn two into one? And it turns out that it is. Well, you can turn two into one by selecting one and suppressing the other one. That's a power-based solution. You can turn two into one by, sort of deciding in favor of one and rejecting what the other one stands for, which is a rights-based solution, like what you would get in court. You can also add them together and divide by two, which is a compromise solution. You can pretend that they're only one, which is denial. You can kind of selectively combine only parts of them, which is a kind of manipulation. But more deeply than this, you can identify what they both have in common. And that is a form of unification of the two sides. You can figure out what is the lowest common denominator for both of them. You can figure out where they intersect and triangulate them. You can figure out what's important to each of them. That is, shift the conversation from positions to interests. And it turns out that interests are non-contradictory, meaning we'll go back to first principles and say there can be two of them at the same time that are true. You feel hot, I feel cold. Which one is true? Well, they're both true. And therefore, what we can do is ask questions that allow people to discover what is true for both of them and to make room within their philosophy, within their life, for opposition, for diversity, for dissent, for contradiction, for complexity, for ambiguity, for transition. And when they do that, when that fundamental philosophical shift takes place, what we discover is that magic has happened. And that is the title of my next book, which is The Magic in Mediation, and the one that I'm working on right now. So that's a kind of basic summary of this. Oh, I guess there's one more last thing I wanted to do, which is, if that's okay. I mean, there are a lot of other ways in which we can apply dialectics in mediation. But what I want to do is I want to end with a quotation from the founder of modern mediation in the United States. His name is Mary Parker Follett, who most people have not heard of, but she wrote in the 1910s and 1920s. And she is also the founder of sort of democratic workplaces and a really wonderful analysis of politics in a book that she wrote called The New State, which I'm working on in this, I'm writing a chapter about in this book that I'm writing now. Here's what she says. Mary Parker Follett. The basis of all cooperative activity is integrated diversity. What people often mean by getting rid of conflict is getting rid of diversity, and it is of the utmost importance that these should not be considered the same. We may wish to abolish conflict, but we cannot get rid of diversity. We must face life as it is and understand that diversity is its most essential feature. Fear of difference is dread of life itself. It is possible to conceive of conflict as not necessarily a wasteful outbreak of incompatibilities, but a normal process by which socially valuable differences register themselves for the enrichment of all concerned. That is synthesis. That is a kind of perfect example and expression of what we're talking about here. We're looking to find ways in which, normal ways, in which differences can be valued and used to enrich everybody who's concerned. That's it, folks.
Again, I thought you've kept 90 minutes for us at least. 60 minutes is not good enough, for sure. 60 minutes, we just try kind of getting started.
Yeah, I agree. This is such, I mean, I'm hoping that this is really useful for you. Its difficulty is to try to figure out how to say these things in a way that doesn't sound, you know, sort of incredibly complicated and difficult and impossible to understand. And unfortunately, a lot of philosophical works are written in that language, which is hard. And if you really want to take an example of this, look at Hegel. He is among the most difficult of people to read. And yet when you really dig in and try to figure out what he's saying, it ends up being quite interesting.
So for illiterate people like me, you need to put it down into very simple language.
That's, I agree that we're back to Einstein again.
but you were saying that you're talking about the benefits of yoga. Catherine actually has a yoga name. It's Parvati. And she, of course, look, the larger concept of yoga. One is the physical movements that people talk about, and then there's a larger concept of yoga, Patanjali's concept. So Catherine is going to tell us, Parvati is going to tell us a little bit about that, I'm sure. Yes, Parvati, you want to tell Ken about your experiences with yoga? But you have to unmute yourself. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yoga teaches us how to live. Hello. How to live in peace with other people, how to pay attention to the needs of other people, how to help other people, how to serve other people, and put them before ourselves. That means not to be selfish, but to take care about all people around us to the extent possible. So this is one of the main principles of yoga, which I have adopted to the extent possible, once again, and which I try to cultivate the more and more, because I am convinced that this is the real goal of life, of a human being in life. Now, besides that, there are specific rules of yoga, which, as a matter of fact, are branches of this main principle and main rule.
Because what happens, Ken, is that a lot of times yoga is discussed in relation to those physical movements. But yoga, of course, encompasses a lot of aspects, which I think sometimes gets lost, because that is what gets focused on. The other thing that I want to show you, because like I said, Mandy had some beautiful thoughts, but those beautiful thoughts came because she's sitting in a place like this. When you're sitting in a place like this, definitely beautiful thoughts would come. So she told us about Symposium, and of course, someone else also told us about Symposium. But Mandy, you want to tell Ken about what is a Symposium, and then how she... Yes.
Yes, I will tell you about Symposium, and I will say something which is connecting Symposium and all these beautiful things that we heard from Master. Thank you so much for sharing and making us part of this. I realize this difficulty not to feel chaotic telling these things, but I have the solution for this problem. The solution is to learn Greek, because each word is a whole conversation, you use one word and you don't have to say something, because each word is a full meaning itself in Greek. I will use an example about these beautiful things you said about synthesis and the statements you said. Synthesis is when you have a position, not itself, in combination with something else. Thesis is the position, and antithesis is the contrapositions. It's also the aposynthesis, which is to be something in synthesis and to separate them, aposynthesis. So if we have, if we say that people are notes in a pentagram, Greek word also, we speak Greek and you don't know it. When we make synthesis, we make a melody, which means that we take many theses, which are the notes, which are the humans, which are their positions, and we make a synthesis. That's how we call the musicians who synthesis and synthesis is when you make a melody. The person who takes notes and makes a melody, which is what maybe we as mediators have to do, which is not only there's yin-yang, but also we are circles, and there is this common space. We are a circle, another circle, and we make a synthesis, which is we have a common part. Or if we put the notes in a pentagram, we make a melody. So we make something new, and you don't have to stop being yourself or your position, but you can make a synthesis with the position of the other person, and to make a melody, to make to renature. Everybody has its nature, and together we can be renatured to something new. It's like taking two colors, the red and the blue, I think. If you make a synthesis of these two colors, you can make a new color. It's called purple, or I don't know. I mean that it's people are afraid to move. They have this statement, but we are not mountains. We are rivers, as you said, and everything changes. So if we realize that our nature is not to be a statement, so maybe we are not afraid to move, because it's our nature to move and change. And
Mandy, the thing is that this is new experience for Ken. He's normally giving lectures about mediation. Today he's getting a lecture about mediation.
but this is what a teacher, when he inspires the students, takes back what he said, but because I had images when you were talking, and I saw all these things I'm saying, I hadn't thought about them. It's the inspiration you give us.
Yes. Thank you.
You haven't told him about the
so
symposium. The important thing you were supposed to tell him, what is
So,
the symposium? You
I
gave him
would
a lecture.
like to say that we talk about mediation and philosophy, but we could meet each other to a symposium and philosophize, not talk about mediation and philosophy, but philosophize, which is the symposium. Drinking, meeting, having dialogues, thinking, and drinking red wine.
So that's why I can't be
And
part of it,
having
because I
joy.
don't drink red wine. I don't drink wine. So definitely I'm out of that symposium, it means.
You will find something to drink, because symposium is like synthesis, symposium. We meet and we drink together.
Okay.
So we will find something.
Okay, so
to
water
drink.
will do. Water will do. That's okay. Yeah. But I think yes.
Something?
Yes, Parvati, please.
I thank Catherine so much that she encouraged me to connect and participate. She is so kind and so helpful.
Thank you too, Mandy.
Thank you.
Yes, Parvati.
I wanted to say the two words which compose the word symposium. Mandy started explaining this. I will add some notions. In ancient Greece and Rome, philosophers used to meet with friends and to drink together. Symposium is a word composed of two others, syn, which means together, like synthesis. Posium comes from the verb pino, I drink. So they used to drink together. I do not know in what situation they were after having done.
That's when philosophizing happens.
There's a wonderful dialogue by Plato, Socratic dialogue called the Symposium. In English, it's Symposium, yeah.
It is one of the main books written by Plato, because as we all know, Socrates has not written. We know his philosophy and all what he has taught through what Plato has written. So one of the main books is the Symposium. Yeah. So Vikram has selected a very, very important word to baptize our event of this month of November.
No, absolutely. And the connection.
Vikram,
no, thank you very much.
Having the opportunity to Hellenic Union of Mediators and to the Organism for Promotion of Alternative Dispute Resolutions to participate with you to the organization of this fantastic symposium. And I want to thank you very, very much for all the work you are doing for us and for all the opportunities you are giving to us to be connected to each other, mediators from all countries all over the world. Thank you very much. Be well, and of course, we'll keep in touch.
Thank you. Thank you, Parvati. Thank you.
I'd like to second those remarks, Catherine. It's very wonderful, the work that you're doing, Vikram. To pick up the idea of philosophy, no one has ever invited mediators to say how they feel about this. And I also deeply respect and appreciate and admire the work that you are doing, and thank you for it. And Catherine, also you for supporting this work and joining in this work with Vikram. Thank you for doing that.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken.
But what came out, Ken, was the definition that I told you that Andrea had put out. I will put that out for you. But before that, the little thing that came out for me from the symposium was that mediators are philosophers in practice and mediation is philosophy in practice. That's that's what I'm taking away from the symposium.
Well done.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So what I'll do is let me just put up the definition that Andrea put out, and then we were of course dissecting it a little bit, and some words we were trying to look at whether those are words which connect to mediation or not, but this is what she had put out.
Can you, instead of reading that now, could you send that to me, Vikram?
Yep, sure. I'll send you the link to that. I won't read it out because I'm sure we've got you a little longer than what you were expecting. I do know that.
I have something else I have to go do right now. But thank you all for coming and for listening and for participating in your ideas. I really love the idea of the melody from the notes. That's really beautiful. Yeah. And again, thank you, Vikram, and we will be back together shortly.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ken. Absolutely.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Bye-bye.
So, thank you, everyone, for, of course, participating in the symposium. And it's been, I still consider it a starting point in relation to the discussion. I think a lot of people, like I was saying, Parvati, I was telling everyone that maybe a lot of people stayed away from the discussion because they didn't know where to connect philosophy and mediation. But after this symposium, I think that connection, I think somewhere has got made, and I think we'll have a much, maybe a broader discussion next time. So that's what I'm expecting. Yes. So any last thoughts from you, Andrea? Anything that you want to end the symposium with?
That was fascinating. And I think if I'm taking away anything from the symposium is I need to read more about Socrates and Plato and everything else, and to understand that more, because it is so much part of what we do. And even though we have as mediators that love of wisdom and we're continuously learning, I think this has just even sparked that even more, that there's more that we need to learn, there's more that we need to understand. And yeah, so well done, Vikram. Again, it was absolutely brilliant. And I love that they're recorded so that we can go back and look at them and kind of pick up from ones that we haven't seen. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody. Today it was lovely to meet you. Mandy, I loved your explanation. It was gorgeous. So thanks everybody, and Catherine as well.
I think what Andrea brought in was a special aspect of philosophy and mediation. So Andrea brought in, Andrea, want to tell them what you brought in? You want to just give a quick thing of what you brought into the symposium?
Well, I don't know that I brought that much, but so I suppose for me, I was one of those who, when I looked at philosophy, kind of went, well, what knowledge have I got to bring into this, and how can I speak on that? And then I suppose I went back to the definition of philosophy, and that was the love of wisdom. So I suppose I took it from a personal perspective, as in the philosophies that I grew up with through my father and the philosophies he taught me, and the thinking that every time I go into a mediation room or go into mediation, they're the philosophies that are with me, as well as the ones that I've picked up along the way. And I suppose remembering as well that every person that comes into mediation, they have their own philosophies, and maybe they came from their place of origin and things they picked up, along the way as well. So it's that, I suppose, understanding that wisdom is not just knowledge, it's experience and how we pass it on as well. So I think that's kind of really what I brought, Vikram. I think maybe I didn't, maybe somebody else got something else from it.
No, it was very nice. And Lizzie, what do you want to end the symposium with? Any thoughts?
Yes, I just wanted to first say thank you. We truly appreciate what you are doing, how you are connecting all mediators, and it is wonderful to learn different perspectives from everyone around the world. So that's really enriching for our field and how to improve our skills. Like Ken was saying, this is the way to get to higher order skills. That's what we need to work on to do a better job succeeding in mediation. So I truly appreciate this opportunity. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone. I will be watching everyone's recordings. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I think the fact that everyone participated, that by itself is a big thing, because nothing goes forward if people don't participate. So, and of course, we've got thoughts from various parts of the world. And Mandy, anything final?
I would, I have no words for the feelings. Hope my smile speaks. I'm very happy you showed pictures of my island and the sea around us, and I keep this image as the blue, the big blue, which is the mediation that connects lands, and that's the color, the sky and the sea of mediation.
No, and yeah, Mandy's session was really nice. The lovely thoughts that she has towards humanity in general and everything. So beautiful thoughts. So Parvati, you have the last word, but let me just tell you that there is, of course, a Zakynthos mediation circle, which is going to be developed.
We are waiting
as part of the Greece mediation circle, which is going to be part of the World Mediation Circle. So we are creating those. But Parvati, your last words from you in relation to the symposium, anything that you want to close it on? Yes, Parvati? Last words from your end? We are closing. Yeah, you have the last word. We are going to close after that. So
once again, I want very much to thank you. First of all, about all the work you are doing these years, and especially for this symposium. And I have to tell you that I'm very much impressed, Vikram. Each time you choose for the beginning of an event something which feeds with the event. You have chosen the 17th of November because it is the day of philosophy. And it is not the first time I noticed this. So it's very clever and very interesting. Of course, I want to thank you very much also for the circle of mediation you are organizing. And I will encourage all, I'll try as much as possible to encourage Greek mediators to become part of this circle. And as far as I am concerned, I would like to subscribe to what you have sent us. And if you want, we can exchange emails about instructions how to do it. Anyhow, the most important is that the work you are doing is tremendous, because it puts together and gives the opportunity of mediators from all over the world to get in touch. And this is very important, because we exchange viewpoints, what we have learned, our mentalities, our way of thinking, and we create also friendship. And this is very important. Thank you very much. Be well and all the best.
Thank you. Good thing to close the session on and the symposium on. Such nice things when you hear, okay, so you know you're doing something right. So thank you very much. And we'll see you then. Next one is starting on the 12th of December, neutrality and mediation. So of course, we'll see you there. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you too.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, Mandy. Bye, Andrea.